Welcome to Shattered, the podcast. This is a podcast where we discuss mental illness. It's by a sufferer, for sufferers, and for the people that are looking to understand what it's like to live with mental illness. G'day and welcome to Shattered, the podcast. How's it going? I'm Mark. Glad to be with you again this week. Today, we're doing something a little bit different. I've got the camera going. We're going to be putting this on the YouTube so you can check it out there. But you'll also still be able to listen to the audio podcast as well. Let's dive right into today's subject. I wanted to talk about myself today. Not for the reason you think, but for people to understand a little bit of where I am coming from with why I talk about what I talk about. Because Shattered, the podcast, is all about explaining to people what it's like to live with a mental illness, what the lived experience is like. Because as I like to say, awareness is good, understanding is much, much better. When somebody understands what a person's gone through, then they're able to get their heads around it. So, my story is a fairly unique one in this world. I do public speaking with a number of other people for an organization in my hometown. And the people that I present with have got significant mental health issues. And many of them have had them their whole lives. For me, I grew up in a perfectly normal family. An incredibly healthy family, actually. A very strong mother, a very strong father, a loving parents that would give me anything, and they did to the best of their ability. I never suffered any abuse. I never suffered any neglect. I basically had a very, very cool upbringing. My parents always took us on holidays. We always did nice things. Even though we weren't rich, my parents were, I guess, thrifty and were able to give us the things that we wanted. We never lacked for anything. There was never anything that we didn't have. My first career that I went into was looking after people with disability. And this kind of grew out of my mum was a nurse. My dad was a radio tech. I never had his engineering mindset, but I had my mother's desire to help people, to look after people, to make sure people feel good. And I fell into the disability world. But I had two very important attributes which set me apart in that world, in the disability care world. The first was that I'm male, and the second was that I am strong. I've always had fairly big shoulders. And the thing about when you're dealing with people with disabilities, particularly acquired brain injury, severe trauma, disabilities that they've grown up with, is when you've got a young lad that grows up to be a man, he is still as violent as he was when he was younger, unless somebody stepped in, which is what it was my job to do. I was part of the teams that would come in and start to work with people that no one could really care for or take care of successfully because of the client's violence and the way that they dealt with issues. So let's take an autistic person. If they learn that if you tell them to put their shoes on and they throw the shoes at you, and then you don't make them put the shoes back on, they've just learned, they've got a learned behavior that they don't have to put their shoes on. And all they have to do to stop that entire process, which they don't want to do, is just throw the shoes at you. And for a child that's learning that way, that we're responding to in a way that's reactive to their behaviors, it's very easy to see why some of these clients learned that violence was the way that they would try and get something. I want a cup of coffee. Can I have a cup of coffee? You say no. I go to the coffee cupboard, I pull out a coffee cup and I throw it at you. And then you make me a cup of coffee. Well, I've just learned that if I throw a cup of coffee at you, I'm going to get a coffee. And if that works, that's what they're going to do. So it's a learned behavior. Our job was to go in and help them to unlearn it. Now, needless to say, this was an incredibly high stress environment to work in. This was a time and place that was exceedingly hard. To give you just one small example of how dangerous it was, I walked into the emergency department at Royal North Shore Hospital. The security guard, as I walked in, Mark, how's it going? First wardsman I saw, oh, g'day, Mark, how's it going? First nurse I saw, Mark, how are you, mate? These people knew me on a first name basis, because if I wasn't in there with a client that had been hurt or injured by somebody else or themselves, I was in there with a staff member or myself. So that just gives you an example of the kind of things that we lived with. People hitting us, kicking us, punching us, people trying to hurt us, trying to slam doors on our arms, trying to slam windows on our heads, trying to headbutt us, trying to do anything to get what they wanted through the means that they'd learned of violence. This took an incredible toll on our mental health. But the thing is, because I'd grown up without knowing anything about mental illness, I thought it was funny when people fell apart. I thought that somebody with a mental illness was just weak and that I was never going to be like them. Now, I would never, ever have been cruel to someone's face, but I would tell stories about somebody behind their back and would make it hilarious, because at the time, in our perspective, it was hilarious. Take, for example, my very first shift. I went into the building, I said hello to the clients, helped get people out of bed. Then somebody said, why don't you take this client across to the shops? And that's all that they said. They didn't tell me that he had a very, very particular way that he liked to go to the shops. When he was finished at the shops, you couldn't say, we're going home. That was a trigger word for him. There was so many things that were missed in this space. And I used to tell this story about how I was walking along with this big old dude, because he was bigger than me. He was massive. He was 6 foot odd. He was a big, big lad. I used to talk about how I said, let's go home. He thought I meant to his home, his mum's home, where he wanted to be. I hated the unit that I was in, didn't ever want to be there. So as soon as I said we're going home, he had a picture in his mind. And then when we started walking back to the unit, he's freaking out. His mind can't work it out. So I'm telling this great joke about a woman's walking past and I have to dive on this guy and tackle him. And police came and ended up abusing me for abusing a person with a disability. And I used to, well, I never drank, but I used to get free beers for this story. You know, I'd tell this story in a pub and people, free Coke for you. What I didn't realize is that was having a catastrophic effect on my mental health. And I paid no attention to it at all. You think you must have paid some attention? I did not. I paid no attention to my mental health whatsoever. So this guy did this. As soon as we got back to the unit, I had to be working with him calm, collected, and just getting him through the rest of the routine. Not forgetting that the guy punched me in the face about 3 or 4 times, tried to choke me, tried to attack somebody else out in the public, and almost throttled a little girl to death. And to top it off, the police abused me because I was trying to stop this guy doing this. They didn't understand what was going on. And I had to just pretend everything was normal. My nose is bleeding, I've got a black eye, and I'm just talking to this guy exactly as I am now. Okay, mate, gonna have a shower. It's time to have a shower because you like to have a shower before dinner. Go have your shower now, then you can have dinner. So go along for 18 years or so of dealing with incidences like that daily, weekly, and on a shift. Not to that extreme violence, but there was always a little bit of violence. So I remember one day, there's a little guy that if you'd wake him up in the morning and you sat too close, he'd throw a punch at you. So if you stood at the door and said, mate, it's time to wake up, he would wake up no problem. But if you made the mistake of going into the room, leaning over his bed, perhaps touching him gently on the shoulder, just a, hey mate, it's time to wake up, he would throw a punch at you. And you just got so used to it that you just deflected it. Because you forget, you're working with a bunch of people, you're in the room, you're close, he throws a punch, you deflect it. All right, mate, come and have breakfast. That was the casualness of the violence. Now, the problem is that from that kind of violence to acting normal, to pretending that somebody just punched you in the face, like a cop or a bouncer, how do they deal with somebody that just punched them in the face and they've got to calm them down? Well, we've all seen the videos of police losing it. We know that it is not healthy to keep all that in. We never talked about it. We never sat down and said, mate, you ended up in the hospital for 3 nights there with concussion. How are you doing? Are you okay? What happened? How can we support you? No, nobody said that. And when the day came that I had my critical incident and ended up not being able to come back to work, I got all the same cliches. Mark, you're important to us. Can't you just shake it off, come into work? Because they'd always seen me do that. They'd always seen me just take a punch and keep going, because that was the job. That was what I thought my career was all about. And of course I was wrong. Of course I was wrong. And then you'd have the staff members that just wouldn't show up one day. Just all of a sudden, one day they weren't there. And you would make fun of them. As I said, you would tell stories. There was a woman showed up on a shift, her very, very first day. And we used to get her to go and clean up a client's bedroom. The staff members on their first day, we always sent them up to clean this guy's bedroom, because this guy would sit in his bed, he would defecate, and then he would take that excrement and he would rub it everywhere. The walls, he'd roll it into balls, stick it in his ears, up his nose, did everything we could to try and stop him. But this was the one thing in his life that he had control over, and he loved to do it. Yeah, we did change that behavior eventually. But our thing to do was, on the first day, was just to send somebody down there that had never worked in the field before, to give them a baptism of fire. Well, this woman walked into the client's room, turned around, walked out, went to the staff room, picked up a bag and her keys, and left. And I used to tell the story. We used to sit in the window going, has she left? Did she just go? I can't believe she just go. And that was it. That was the last we ever saw of her. And as I said, I used to make a joke about that. Now I've got nothing but respect for her, because she realized that it was too much for her. She realized that pushing through was not going to be a healthy thing for her. And there's so many times that I should have done that. I should not have pushed through. I should have said, hang on, this is taking a toll on me, and I should be doing something else. If not a different job in that field, or something out of the field completely. It didn't matter to me. But in retrospect, I know that I should have done something else, and I regret to this day that I didn't, because I thought I was doing a good thing. I thought I was doing God's work. I was helping people with disability. I was making a difference in somebody's life every single day of the week. But I was killing my mental health. I'm just like you. I didn't know what it was like to live life with a mental illness. I had no idea. I had no concept. I've used this analogy a lot. It's like when somebody says they got a bad back. Until you've got a bad back, you cannot truly understand how bad it is without watching them closely. Asking somebody, why don't you sit down? You've got a bad back, sit down. Well, walking around, it's less pain. But the more I walk around, the sorer it gets. But I'd rather take the long-term pain than the short, sharp pain. So the things that people are doing, and you look at people with mental illness, and they're probably doing things that to you seem very, very strange or weird. They may respond in different ways that you don't like. It's got nothing to do with you. It's just them trying to make it through a day. My encouragement is, stigma is bad. awareness is better than stigma, but understanding is best of all. Have a great week. Talk to you later. Hope you enjoy the video.
Thank you for listening to Shattered the podcast. I'd like to thank our producer Meredith Brosnan, our executive producer Torian Lau, and the band Adelaide for allowing us to use their song as our theme. Go to shatteredthepodcast.com for more information.